all night.
Run. The Welsh Government has been defending its decision to become the first part of the UK to legislate for a ban on electronic cigarettes and including workplace anti-smoke devices of cigarettes. But Dr. Julie, Health Wales says smoking shouldn't be tolerated again.
We recognise that there is a potential benefit for public health for people switching from tobacco cigarettes to e-cigarettes. But this piece of legislation is about actually the wider population impact of potentially re-establishing a smoking culture.
So, as I may have said before, where Wales goes, can San Francisco be far behind? Because there are already some e-cigarette bans in the States, but in Chicago and in New York, but not in a place that led the way really in banning real tobacco, San Francisco. Joining us to debate the point of how much of a health risk e-cigarettes and vaping really are Spike Babayan, who is the founder of Vape NY. Hello, Spike.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Jolly nice to have you with us. Thank you very much. And did I make a terrible mess of your last name?
No, that was actually perfect. Thank you.
Oh, I see. Excellent. Good. Well, we can hear you beautifully. I know you're in the car, so that's just great. Let's also introduce Professor Stanton Glantz, who is Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education at UC San Francisco. Hello, Professor Glantz.
Hello. And one correction, e-cigarettes are included in the clean indoor air laws here in San Francisco, as well as Los Angeles, and about 350 other places around the United States.
As many as that, really. Well, I stand completely corrected. I some poor information there. So there is no question about e-cigarettes being legal in most parts of the U.S. Is that right?
Well, e-cigarettes themselves are legal everywhere that I know of in the U.S. The real question is whether they should be allowed to be used indoors in places where smoking is no longer permitted. And while there's the actual complete health risks associated with people using e-cigarettes themselves are not yet fully defined, we already know that e-cigarettes pollute the air around them, and that bystanders who choose not to use e-cigarettes absorb nicotine, ultrafine particles, and other chemicals that e-cigarettes put into the air. And so the reason it's sensible to include e-cigarettes in clean indoor air laws is that we've spent all this time cleaning up the air indoors, and we simply shouldn't be dirtying.
We'll get you back in a minute. That sounds like Professor Glantz just dropped out for a second there. Let's go to Spike. Are you still with us, Spike?
Yes, I am.
Good. Well, there's plenty to be getting on with. He's talking about e-cigarettes dirtying the air indoors. How do you see it?
Well, Professor Glantz is correct in that there are ultrafine particles in the air. The question is whether or not those particles are toxic to bystanders. So there are particles in the air we breathe when we walk outside every day. There are particles from everything, from, people spitting and cars and germs and trees and pollen and everything. So while there are particles released by e-cigarettes, the real question is whether or not those ultrafine particles are considered toxic to the bystanders. So as I mentioned, I spoke in front of the FDA at their third workshop on electronic cigarettes last week, and there were a number of studies presented which are not published yet, which are not common information yet, but they were presented to the FDA at this workshop regarding whether or not the secondhand vapor is considered to be toxic. While there were studies that showed yes and there were studies that showed no, there was no definitive answer to that yet. So
let's put that to Professor Glantz. I mean, Professor Glantz, you're back. I'm glad to see you. You must be across all the literature. What do you make of that?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, the fact that I wasn't at the workshop, and I don't know which of the studies that were presented were done by the tobacco industry, which never finds anything as bad. But the important point, which the other speaker made, is that some of the studies are finding adverse health effects, and it's almost certainly true that e-cigarettes aren't as polluting as cigarettes are, and probably aren't as bad for the person using them as cigarettes are. But that doesn't mean that they're not problematic. And just as we argued back in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s when we were getting the clean indoor air laws passed. If somebody wants to use an e-cigarette and they do it in a way that doesn't hurt anybody else, that's their business. But we already know for sure that people using e-cigarettes are absorbing nicotine into their bodies, the addictive element in cigarette smoke. We know that they're taking in ultrafine particles and other toxins, and we know
so that's
that
like,
ultrafine
you say
particles,
that's like secondhand smoking.
well, it's analogous to secondhand smoking. The e-cigarettes almost certainly produce fewer cancer-causing chemicals than cigarettes do because they don't burn anything. But 2/3 of the people who die from smoking die from heart attacks and non-cancer lung disease, and those ultrafine particles have been clearly linked to inflammatory processes triggering heart attacks and causing other problems, and triggering problems, non-cancer problems, but breathing problems in the lungs. And bystanders shouldn't have to put up with that. I think people who choose to use e-cigarettes should make sure they don't use them at home around other people. They should just be using them in ways where they're getting whatever they get from them, but they don't hurt anybody else.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Glantz. I'm going to give the last word to Spike now. Just to say, the Professor's point is that where caution is justified, we ought to be approaching these things with caution, Spike. You can't go into this without knowing all the ins and outs.
I would agree with that. I actually was a co-author on the first study in the United States to test e-cigarette vapor to determine if there were toxins. So I would encourage all the governments to look at the studies to find whether or not the ultrafine particles and byproducts of the e-cigarette vapor has any chemicals at toxic levels. Because while Professor Glantz does mention that there are toxins in the vapor, he does not say whether they're at toxic levels to either the user or the bystander. So my concern is that they're jumping the gun to make decisions on something that has not been shown to cause any harm to bystanders yet. And by doing that, you're asking someone who has quit smoking and is using only an electronic cigarette to stand outside where there's secondhand smoke and breathe in secondhand smoke and be around smokers, which may entice them back to cigarettes, which is a big concern and has been a problem here in New York City where we did have an indoor ban. And when e-cigarette users are outside in a smoking area, they're often enticed to have a cigarette because their friends are out there smoking and they'll have a real cigarette. So we're concerned that we're going to lose people back to smoking because of some of these bans.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us, both of you. Spike Bababian, who runs Vape NY, a chain of e-cigarette stores in New York, and Professor Stanton Glantz from the University of California in San Francisco. Well, in Spain,